Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell, and delighted to be with you today. Looking forward to another great study from the Word of God. And with me is, of course, my illustrious co-host, Dr. Don K. Preston. How are you today? What's going on in your neck of the woods?
Well, it's great to be with you as well, Dr. Bell. As always, things are just motivating right along here in the brand new year. It is as I expected it to be, ultra hectic, but that's okay. That's wonderful, as a matter of fact. I'm so far behind on my correspondence, I may never get caught up. I have already received, so far this year, at least one, perhaps 2, requests from individuals who are writing books, and they have asked me to take a look at their manuscripts, to give my feedback on them. I try to be as accommodating as possible. I know what it's like. I know the struggles that you have to go through in order to get a book published, and I try to be as helpful to new authors as I possibly can and try to encourage that along the line. But boy, when I'm doing my own books, as I am right now, surprise, surprise, it takes away an awful lot of time from my writing, from my research, to read those manuscripts. But again, I want to be of help. I want to encourage these younger guys that are sitting down and putting their thoughts to paper and trying to help other people to see and to share in their journey from the dispensational and the futurist world. One young man, has just sent me a manuscript. He would still probably consider himself a partial preterist, but definitely leaning toward the full preterist view. I won't mention any names whatsoever, but he and I have been corresponding for a good long while, and he has shared with me his struggles in trying to come to grips with the paradigm shift that is involved in making the move to full preterism. He acknowledges that he sees the logic. He has lots of questions. Well, that's just normal. You're never going to arrive at a time, even as a full preterist, that you don't have questions. If you no longer have any questions, you're probably not studying anymore. That's kind of my philosophy about it. So anyway, that's kind of the way things are going. It's exciting to be involved and to be able to be helpful to other people in their journey, and as they set out to try to do their own writing. And I just received an invitation I guess I received it at the end of last week, but we confirmed it today or yesterday, an invitation to have a Zoom get-together with a gentleman who started out as a dispensationalist and has encountered difficulties understanding and harmonizing that view. And so he has started reaching out to some scholars. So far, he has interviewed in Zoom meetings some scholars from the dispensational world, from the amillennial world, and what have you. And so he reached out to me and asked me if I'd be willing to do a Zoom meeting that he could share with his viewers. And so I'll be doing that, Lord willing, I think it's the 22nd of this month. So things like that continue to happen. Opportunities continue to open up that are very exciting, and that we hope will be helpful to other people as they examine their own views and as they try to come to grips with the difficulties that are inherent in the futurist views. And of course, continue to have exchanges with individuals on Facebook and and to engage in some of these guys who think they have found a fallacy in full preterism, and when they post their posts, they're very quickly confronted, and all of a sudden they just disappear from the discussions that they began. They just disappear because they realize they cannot answer the answers that have been given to their challenges. And I've tagged you over the last few days on one of those. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read any of that or not, but it's been really quite humorous, as this one young guy who thinks he's just God's answer to preterism, and yet over and over and over again, he begins these conversations. He gets nailed to the wall, not only by me, but others as well, who are very, very astute, very logical. They're very sharp. And so all of a sudden, he just disappears, literally disappears. And when you come back at him and you point out that he abandoned the previous discussions, then his answer to that, well, I answered that already. There's no sense to go back over that territory. When in reality, he didn't answer anything. Literally did not answer anything. So I've had people ask me, and you and I have talked about it an awful lot of times, why I continue to engage in those kind of conversations. And the reason is quite simple. It's not because I believe that this young man is going to change his mind at all. He has already demonstrated that he has no integrity, no honesty. He has no willingness to listen to sound arguments. But when you engage in that type of thing, and when you demonstrate that they cannot answer the arguments, there are other people that are auditing those conversations. They're reading them, and you know that you're having an impact on their hearts, on their lives, on their minds. And so, we just keep plugging away, demonstrating that these futurists who think they are God's gift to refute preterism, and you show that they're not God's gift to anyone. They have no answers whatsoever. So it has been a really, really, really busy new year with great promise for the rest of the year. And I know you've got a ton of stuff going on as well. So you might share with us some of those things that you're involved in right now that are going on in your world.
Well, I'm like you, catching up with a lot of things that I'm behind on, and working on a couple of manuscripts that I'm trying to at least just make progress on. I'm not going to say finish them. I'm going to say just make some progress on them, at least touch them and look at them every day. I was having a conversation I have looked at some of the dialogue that's been going on Facebook. I do go in and read when you tag me and just kind of look at the conversations. Most of the time, as you say, they've been handled so well that there's really nothing else that needs to be said for the most part. I did engage in one. I think someone had asked a question, and I think this was a preterist who asked the question, but other people were chiming in on it. And of course, that was the one about, is the world getting better or worse? You have the futurist paradigm that many of them argue that, the world is getting so bad, and if full preterism is true, why is everything going like it's going, so to speak? And I tried to give
Yep.
some perspective to that. I've talked to you before about, the book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and the decline of violence and some other things where, people have documented these things. And so, if they're out there even paying attention, they would see that. Even if they just use a little common sense, they would see, that the world is better in many, many ways. It's not to say that there's not, these other things going on. But I also, had someone to invite me to India. And, I thought it was like, okay, I will, and I still don't know all the details of it. But it just goes to show you, they shared with me their congregation and said, well, would you like to come to India? I said, well, of course. They said, well, when? I said, well, when the arrangements can be made. And so he said, okay, we can handle that. I wasn't expecting that answer. They said, we can handle that. So I'll have to follow up with them. Yeah, it is. I'll have to follow up with them and just see, what's involved in that invitation. But I'm excited. I never expected to, be a world traveler from that perspective. But as you know, we've got kind of a standing invitation to Jakarta, Indonesia, this year, as a matter of fact, and then now here's India, and of course several places in Africa have been requested. I think I mentioned the one in South Africa just recently. But anyway, that's pretty much what's going on. I'm still trying. It's like pulling eye teeth, trying to get my last speech. What I'm saying is the last speech from these guys who recorded the debate in Ghana. It's really, really frustrating and disappointing that it was promised on yesterday that I would have the last one. And I talked to, the people who did it. They said it was forthcoming, and I got nothing yesterday. I got nothing today. And so that's been extremely frustrating. And I don't know, they wanted to air the debate on, public TV there, and they can't even send me all the files. I don't know what they have as far as that goes. And that's why I told them, no, not until I at least get a chance to look and see what all we do have. And, I think some things are missing that I'll never know. I mean, it's, this far away from it, I can't even remember. I'm looking for a particular, I did find one section, but I'm looking for another section that I knew I made some arguments on. Haven't found that yet, and I'm hoping that it's in this last segment, but I don't know. So it's just been a disappointment on that all around, and as far as getting these files from them, and I don't know if I will get it or not, but I will just keep asking and keep pushing these guys to go ahead and send that over. And, see.
It really is sad. I mean, it's just really, really sad, as we've discussed before. You have men that claim to be the servants of the Lord, men who claim to be Christians, and yet they do not have the courage and the integrity to do what they claimed and promised to do. And they play all sorts of little games. They play political games. And they refuse to give what they promised to give. Now, we all understand that when you're dealing in audio and video and technology, we understand that things can happen. But it's just so convenient that they come up after promising that they would provide, and they filmed it, and all of a sudden, when they start sending you the files, I mean, it's worse than Watergate. You have all of these elements of time from your speeches, conveniently enough, that are just mysteriously missing. And I tell you, it really, really, really makes a person, I don't know if paranoid is the word, but suspicious is certainly a proper word, and we have every right in the world to expect and to demand that these people carry through with their word. And so I know that you will keep after them. You'll keep pressing them. You'll keep encouraging them to live up to their word. I mean, Christian's word means something or not. That's what it comes down to as far as I'm concerned. And so it's just very frustrating. Pardon me. So hopefully they'll come through. Hopefully they won't play any more games, and you'll get all of that video so that the debate can be posted. I mean, you and I both know why they would not want all of your speech and your speeches posted. I mean, it's not braggadocio. The point of fact is that, especially after the debate is over, they realize they don't want their audience to see and to hear what you had to say. It's really that simple. That's my estimation of it. And so the best way to prevent that is to say, boy, Brother Bell, we're just awfully sorry about this, but for some reason or other, there's just a great big chunk of the video missing, and it's just a chunk out of your speeches. It's not our speeches. It just happens to be yours. And it just happens to be on those subjects and on those arguments in which you answered everything that we had to say. Gee, it's just purely coincidence. But, we're sorry. Nothing to see here, so let's move on. Yeah. You can call me paranoid. You can call me suspicious. You can call me doubtful. Experience in dealing with folks has made me this way, and that's all there is to it. So anyway, pardon me. All of that said, want to get back into our text of we've been looking at Ezekiel chapter 44 and some of the difficulties that are inherent in the text. If a person takes this as speaking of the Messianic Temple, the Kingdom Temple, because as we shared last week, and we want to delve deeper into this. I mean, we talked about it a good little bit last week, but I really believe it's worth recapitulating the issue because, as I shared last week, when you bring to the forefront the problems that a literalistic interpretation of Ezekiel 44, when you share what it means if it is talking about a future Messianic temple, then all of a sudden, I mean, literally, and I said this last week, what you find is that so very, very often you find people that just simply tell you, well, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. Or I have had people tell me, well, you're just offering an argument I've never heard before. So we're just not going to talk about this, or that's irrelevant, or whatever. Well, none of those arguments answer the argument, and the argument is this: in Ezekiel chapter 44, 9 and following, the Lord, and remember now, if this is talking about, and let me emphasize, if this is talking about the Messianic millennial temple that will supposedly, according to the dispensational paradigm, that will supposedly be rebuilt or built after the second coming of the Lord, okay? If that's what this is describing, the Lord says here in Ezekiel 44, 9 and following, that no one uncircumcised in heart or in flesh shall enter that temple. Well, you see, dispensationalists, they come to Ezekiel 40 to 47, and they tell us, okay, yes, we're going to have a restoration of the priesthood, only it will be not a restoration of the Levitical priesthood completely. It will actually be the restoration of the Zadokite priesthood. And they go here in Ezekiel 44, verse 11 and following, in which the Lord gave the reason why the Zadokites would minister in the temple, but the Levites would not. Set that aside for just a moment. What they tell us is, yes, in this Messianic millennial temple, you're going to have both the Zadokite priesthood and the Levitical priesthood. Then, they tell us, yes, you are going to have the restoration of physical animal sacrifices. You are going to have the restoration of the Jewish feast days. It's been my experience in reading dispensational literature down through the years. They don't honestly really like to talk about Ezekiel 44, 9, and 10. In most of their literature, they talk about the Zadokite priesthood. They talk about the Levitical priesthood. They talk about the animal sacrifices. They talk about the literal temple. But again, it has been my experience that very, very commonly, dispensationalists completely ignore. They just gloss right over the subject of physical circumcision. And I think anyone that thinks about this very much can understand the reason why. And that is because the gospel of Jesus Christ condemns physical circumcision as a religious mandate and as a religious practice. Paul said he is a Jew, or he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, but who is a Jew inwardly. And that circumcision is not the circumcision that is outward, but it is the circumcision of the heart, Romans 2, 28 and 29. And Paul was so emphatic about it in the book of Galatians. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything but faith which works through love. And Paul went ahead to say, well, he actually said before that verse, he said, this I say therefore and testify in the Lord, that if any man is circumcised and keeps the law of Moses, he is debtor to do the whole law. The whole law. I mean, just puts a cap on it. Those of you who seek to be justified by the law, through circumcision, in other words, you are fallen from grace. Now, I don't know how words could get any clearer. I really honestly don't know how words could get any clearer. If you're circumcised to keep the law, to be justified, you're fallen from grace. If you're circumcised, Christ profits you nothing. Now, that doesn't mean if you're circumcised as a purely physical, hygienic, so to speak, purpose. And, most parents have their sons circumcised, and the son has no choice about it. Well, okay, does that mean then if a child that has been circumcised at their parents' direction, does that mean that child can never have the benefit of Christ? Well, that would be a really rotten deal, I would think. And so, we've got these real serious conundrums in regard to the issue of circumcision. So back to the point I made a moment ago. When you're dealing with dispensationalists, as I have a great deal down through my life and through my ministry, they will tell you right up front, yes, there will be animal sacrifices in the millennium. When you talk to them about the temple, they said, absolutely, yes, there will be a literal physical temple in the millennium. And that's what Ezekiel is all about. And when you talk about the Levitical priesthood, yes, the Levitical priesthood will be restored, but it will not be, they won't have the place of prominence and power and position that they had under the law of Moses. They will have a secondary position, and that's based, by the way, right here on Ezekiel 44, all right? And they tell you, yes, there's going to be a Zadokite priesthood, which of course is related to the Levitical priesthood, but the Zadokite priesthood will be the exalted priesthood because they were obedient when the rest of the Levites were not. And so then you ask them, will there be physical circumcision mandated by God, necessary, number one, to be able to enter into Jerusalem? Now, let's keep this in mind. According to Zechariah chapter 14, after the day of the Lord, which is after the second coming, which is the time of this Messianic Temple, we are told by the dispensationalists, at that period of time, Zechariah says, it shall come to pass that out of all of the nations of the earth that do not go to Jerusalem and there to worship, they shall be cursed. So, in this proposed millennium that the dispensationalists hypothesize about, everyone on the face of the earth is required to go to Jerusalem to worship. And oh, by the way, they're required to celebrate and to observe the Jewish feast days, particularly the Feast of Tabernacle, according to Zechariah chapter 14. And if they don't, they are cursed. Now, the dispensationalist goes to Zechariah chapter 14, and they read the description, and they say, well, the way they're cursed is it will be like an atomic blast. Their faces, their skin will just melt off of their faces. They really get graphic about all this. So the point being that in the dispensational view, you absolutely must go to Jerusalem. You must go worship at the temple. You absolutely must observe the Jewish feast days, specifically and particularly the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, according to Ezekiel 40 to 47, it's more than the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, they run into problems. Number one, when you begin to talk to the dispensationalists and you ask them, why would God reinstitute animal sacrifices? Because according to Hebrews chapter 10, 5 and following, in sacrifice, in offering, an offering for sin, you have had no pleasure, but a body you have prepared for me. Speaking of the body of Christ. Okay, then if God has never had pleasure in animal sacrifices, and if animal sacrifices, if the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin, according to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 2 and following, then why in the world would God reinstitute and restore bloody animal sacrifices in this millennial temple? Well, I can tell you that dispensationalists have pondered long about this. They have felt the heat of this argument, and so they have come up with an argument over the last 30, 40 years, and they have said, well, the sacrifices will not be to make an atonement. They will not be to make atonement for sin. They will be in memoriam of the sacrifice of Jesus. Well, unfortunately for the dispensationalists, according to Ezekiel 45, verse, it's either 16 or 17, I've forgotten which at the moment, it specifically says that those sacrifices would be made to make atonement for sin. So whereas the dispensationalists realize that it's really problematic to argue for animal sacrifices in the millennial temple, since the New Testament teaches that bloody sacrifices were never God's original plan. They were always typological. They were not the true sacrifices that God wanted. Okay. So how do the dispensationalists get away with that? Well, they tell us, the sacrifices are for memorial of the sacrifice of Jesus. No, that's never said in Ezekiel. Over and over in Ezekiel, we are told the sacrifices would be to make atonement for sin. By the way, the terminology that is used to make atonement for sin is the exact same precise language that is used in the book of Exodus, in the book of Leviticus, and the book of Numbers when it is talking about the regular bloody sacrifices under the law of Moses that were made to make atonement for sin. There's absolutely no verbal linguistic difference in that terminology. So it's a little bit difficult, it's a little bit tough to go to Ezekiel 45, which emphatically says that the sacrifices would be made to make an atonement for sin, and to say, well, yeah, it's not really for an atonement. It's really actually as a memorial because atonement has been made. When, number one, it never says that it's for an atonement, or as a memorial of the atonement that had already been made. And number two, it uses the exact precise language that is used in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, to speak about sacrifices that were made to obtain the atonement. That's one of the major problems that dispensationalists run into, that they encounter in their view of this Messianic Temple of Ezekiel 44, 45, all the way through the end of the chapter. And listen, I can tell you right now, in formal public debates that I've had and in countless private discussions with dispensationalists, they feel this pain and this problem acutely. I'll share an anecdote here very quickly. Many years ago, pardon me, when I was the minister at the East Main Church of Christ in Shawnee, I was there for 11 years, had a wonderful experience there, but nonetheless, one Sunday night after services, I was standing on the north end of a long hallway that ran east or north and south. And I was talking with one of the members of the congregation. And I looked up, and in the front door at the south end of the hall, I see this really scruffy guy come in. His clothing was dirty. His hair was completely disheveled. And I thought, well, here we have a benevolent case that wants to talk to me, undoubtedly. And about that time, they walked up to one of our members and said something to them. That member turned around and pointed to me, and I thought, well, yeah, here we go. And we tried to be a very generous congregation. We tried to help out when we could. We helped an awful lot of people. We did some really genuinely good, benevolent work at that congregation. It was some stuff that I was very, very proud of. We normally had, obviously, we had some freeloaders. We had found a way to thin them out and to discover the people with genuine needs, these were people that needed help. And we were very, very fortunate to be able to help them, and we did. So all of that aside, the gentleman walks down the hallway, comes up to me, and he said, are you Don Preston? I said, yes, I am. He said, you're the minister. Yes, sir. And he said, my name is, and I've forgotten his name now, to be honest about it, but it turned out that he was the nephew of one of our members. And I'd never met him before. I'd heard about him, but I'd never met him. And so I said, okay, how can we help you? And he said, well, I'll tell you what, premillennialist. I said, okay. And he just paused. He said, I'm a premillennialist. But he said, I want to tell you something. If you can prove to me that dispensationalism is wrong, I will be baptized. I said, okay, I accept that. I'll be glad to accept that. And he said, now, I'll be really honest with you. I know my stuff. I've been studying hard. And he said, I've been reading some of the top dispensational writers, and I personally know some of them. And I correspond with them. Now, this is way before I knew anything called a computer, and certainly didn't know how to use one, even if I would have known about it. But anyway, he said, I've been corresponding, and he said, I've been talking to him over the phone. He said, I know my stuff. I said, okay, that's fine. And he said, not only that, if you agree to study with me, he said, I'll be talking to them when we're studying. He said, after you and I are through studying, he said, I will be contacting them. I'll be sharing with them what you say. And he said, I'm going to be comparing notes with what you say. I said, doesn't bother me a bit. I said, matter of fact, I like the idea. I said, because I want you to be able to have the very best arguments possible. Let me see here. I don't know if he hit the right button. I tell you, our phone has just been blowing up with spam callers lately. It's just terrible. So anyway, I told him, I said, I want you to be aware of, I want you to know, and I want you to present the very best arguments in proof of dispensationalism that you can come up with. I said, I don't care who you call. I don't care what books you read. I want you to give me your very best shot. He said, well, you better know I'm going to do that. I said, okay, that's great. When we went through the material on the sacrificial system of this so-called millennial temple, when we went through the subject of circumcision in the millennial temple, when we went through the subject of the land promises, oh, and by the way, the land promises in conjunction with the issue of the Levites and the Levitical priesthood and the land promises. We studied about 5 weeks, and we studied at least 2 times a week. And generally speaking, we studied an absolute minimum of 2 hours and sometimes 4 hours per session. And I was there on that particular night, and I knew that he had been seeing a lot of the force and the power of the arguments that I had been sharing with him. And again, I want our audience to realize, and I'm not just simply telling a story here that turned out really happily for me, if you wish to put it that way. No, I'm sharing with you because here is a man that was totally dedicated to the dispensational view of the millennial temple of Ezekiel 40 to 47. Here is a man that was totally committed to the doctrine that the land that we call the land of Israel to this day, that land no longer belongs to them. But he was totally committed to the idea that it does. We were studying that night. We had been at it for probably 2 hours. And I've forgotten now the exact precise point that I made, but again, it had something to do with the issues that I've just mentioned. And he just looked at me for a moment. And he closed his Bible. And I'm thinking, uh-oh. Uh-oh. And he said, okay. And I said, okay, what? he said, I'm ready to be baptized right now. And I go, oh, wow, okay. That's awesome. And he said, I've got to tell you. He said, it's just like I told you the very first time we talked. I had been reading dispensational books, articles. I had been talking on the phone with some of the leading dispensationalists. He had spent a lot of time, evidently, on the phone with a dispensational writer, author, televangelist out of Oklahoma City by the name of J.R. Church. I don't know if you're familiar with that name or not, William, but very, very prominent dispensational writer and televangelist. So again, here was a young man that was thoroughly conversant with the doctrine of the Messianic Temple and what it meant, and the ins and the outs of the doctrine, but he had never, ever been confronted with the problems of that view concerning the physical animal sacrifices, concerning circumcision, and concerning the land promises. You know, one of his most adamant arguments was Israel had never, ever possessed the land. And, of course, William, you and I both know how easy it is to refute that doctrine. I mean, we have statements taken at the time of the invasion of the land, at the end of the invasion of the land, that said that God gave them all of the land. Not one word of the promises that God had given them. This is Joshua 21, 43 to 45. Not one word failed. We have time statements, or we have statements taken from the time of the United Kingdom, 1 Kings chapter 4, 20 and 21, that God gave Israel all of the land that he had promised them, and he even gave the boundaries and the borders of the land that he had promised them. But he gave the borders of the land over which David ruled. And by the way, the borders that are given in that passage of 1 Kings are actually larger than the borders that are given in Genesis chapter 15. So God not only fulfilled the promise to give them the land that was promised in Genesis chapter 15, he gave them more land than he promised. And that was under both David and Solomon. And we have statements after the return from the Babylonian captivity in Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 6 and following. As Nehemiah looks back on the promises that God made to Abraham, he mentions the very borders and the boundaries of the kingdom, or excuse me, of the land that had been promised. He said, I'm going to give you the land of the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and blah, blah, blah. And he says, you have fulfilled your word. How much more emphatic could it be? Nehemiah gives the promise that God made to Abraham to give the land. He gives the boundaries of the land. He gives the inhabitants of the land. And he says, you have fulfilled your promises. I mean, I just don't know how much clearer it could be. So all of that said, here was a young man that was completely sold on the dispensational paradigm, but had never encountered the problem of circumcision. Well, again, let's keep in mind what that problem of circumcision is. According to Paul in the Gospels, or in the Gospel as he presented it, circumcision is forbidden followers of Christ for religious reasons. And if you're going to observe circumcision as a command of God, you must keep all of the law. William, do you remember the debate I had right there in Memphis with the young man? I've forgotten his first name. Michael Bugg, exactly. Yes. And he was a very nice young man. He was obviously, as we learned, being groomed to be one of the leaders of that Messianic, Torah observant group. But he didn't know how to answer these arguments. But he did agree that we had to observe circumcision.
Yes, I remember that.
But he didn't offer animal sacrifices. And he didn't believe if you were not circumcised that you'd be condemned. Well, that's not according to what Paul said. It's not what, the Judaizers of Acts chapter 15 said that those coming into Christ had to keep the law of Moses and be circumcised to be saved. Well, guess what? These Torah observant believers today, they say, well, yeah, you got to be circumcised. Oh, but it's not for salvation. Well, how are you different from the Judaizers that Paul condemned? The point that we're trying to make here, folks, is that according to Paul, the law of Moses, with the mandate, with the command to be circumcised, is no longer valid. It is not applicable to Christians. And those 3 points that he makes in Galatians chapter 5 simply cannot be gotten around. You have to pervert, you have to distort, or you have to ignore the language. You know, just the other day in the comments on one of my YouTube videos, I had a guy, and he's always very, very cordial, very friendly, generally speaking, very, very complimentary of my YouTube videos. And yet he posted on there, and he said all of the commands of the Old Covenant are still binding today, but he went ahead to amend that to say, well, except the animal sacrifices, we don't have to do those. And we don't have to be circumcised. Well, where do you come up with that idea? How do you say all of the commands of the Old Covenant are still applicable today, except Paul said if you're going to bind the Old Covenant, you're going to bind all of it. So what that means in our discussion of the Messianic Temple, ladies and gentlemen, is when the dispensationalists go to Ezekiel chapter 40 through 47, and they say, yes, sir, we are going to have the Levitical priesthood and we're going to have the Zadokite priesthood. Well, if you're going to take part of the law, you got to take it all. And they tell us, well, yes, there are going to be animal sacrifices. Well, okay. If you're going to have animal sacrifices, you got to keep the whole law. Oh, well, we got to have a physical temple. Well, guess what? Physical temple was mandated by the old law. So if you're going to mandate a physical temple, guess what? You've got to impose the entirety of the old law. Oh, and that means if you're going to impose or if you're going to teach that, yes, there will be animal sacrifices in this literal physical temple, then guess what? You've got to teach the whole law. You've got to observe the whole law. Back to this specific issue of Ezekiel 44, 9 and following. It shall come to pass that no stranger, no foreigner that is among you, that is uncircumcised in heart or in the flesh, shall enter my sanctuary. Well, okay, then that brings us back to Paul, Galatians 5. If any man is circumcised, he is a debtor, he is obligated to keep the whole law. And you know, William, I just find it abundantly strange how anyone, and I say with this with all due respect, I really honestly do, because I know that these people are there are people who love the Lord and they want to do what is right. And yet they get caught up in this system that demands that they observe the Jewish feast days. And yet here's Paul saying to Christians who are being told they had to keep the law of Moses and be circumcised, and they had to observe the feast days. And Paul says, let no man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. And yet, here is this entire Torah observant movement that says you'll be judged if you do not observe the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, and if you're not circumcised. And so it is a complete and total mystery to me how people can read these passages and they can be convinced that Paul didn't really mean what he said. That it's not only okay to observe the Jewish feast days, it's mandated. And it's not only okay to be physically circumcised as a religious practice, but it's mandated. And it's not only okay to observe new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, but it's okay to be judged righteous or unrighteous based upon whether or not you do observe the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. And again, I mean no disrespect because, listen, I correspond and I hear from a lot of people on a regular basis who've been caught up in that Torah observant movement. And they're wonderful people. And William, you've heard from lots of people exactly the same situation. They are people who are doing their best to please the Lord. They thought that was what they were expected and demanded by the Lord to obey. So it's not that they were dishonest at all. It's just that I'll use the terminology, it's terminology that they use, they were deceived. And I can tell you, and William, there at Memphis, when was that? Was that in 2016 that I spoke there on the Jewish feast days?
I think that was that 2018, I thought.
Okay, I believe you're right. I believe it's 2018. Okay, I don't know if I ever shared with you or not, but after I gave my presentation on the Jewish feast days, I had 2 or 3 ladies come up to me who had themselves been involved in the Torah observant movement. And they told me that my lesson was one of the most fantastic lessons. And I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back at all. But they shared with me how their understanding of the fulfillment of the feast days as I had presented it was one of the most enlightening, liberating lessons that they had ever heard in their lives. Now, mind you, they had already become full preterists. So my lesson is not what convinced them of the full preterist view. My lesson confirmed what they had been learning in a way that they had not seen presented by any preterist. And they were excited to the moon about what they had heard. And of course, you and I, over the last several years, have been involved in deeper and deeper study of the Jewish feast days and how important they are to understanding the biblical narrative of eschatology. And our understanding, ladies and gentlemen, of the Jewish feast days will help us to realize how dangerous it is to go to Ezekiel 40 to 47 and try to impose the observance of the Jewish feast days, animal sacrifices, and guess what? Physical circumcision, and again, animal sacrifices. You see, it comes down to this. Paul taught emphatically, as we've already noted, physical circumcision for religious reasons, to be justified, to be saved, to obey the gospel, is anathema. It is wrong. It is a violation of the gospel of Christ. Now, I want you to listen very carefully, ladies and gentlemen. Pardon me. According to Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who is considered by Thomas Ice, his main go-to guy. He was a practicing Jew, and he was converted from that into Christianity. Arnold Fruchtenbaum says, there will never be a time in which the gospel of Christ is not operative. Well, amen. Well, Thomas Ice, I sent Thomas Ice an email some years ago on this very issue. And I asked Thomas Ice, will there ever be a time in which the gospel of Christ will not be operative and authoritative and to be the final word of God? And he wrote back and he said, absolutely not. The gospel of Christ will never pass away. There will never be a time in which the gospel of Christ is inoperative or will be set aside in any way whatsoever. Okay. So here are some, shall we say, leading dispensationalists. And they tell us that the gospel will never be set aside. It will never be mitigated. It will never be nullified. That means it will always be in effect. That means it will never be okay to be physically circumcised to be justified. It will never be okay to be physically circumcised because, you see, that's the gospel. That's Paul's doctrine of the gospel of Christ. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything but faith, which works through love. So here's what it comes down to. If a person is going to say, well, yes, Ezekiel 44, Ezekiel 42:47, describes a literal physical Messianic temple that will be constructed in the millennium after the second coming. That means that physical circumcision will be absolutely mandated. And if you are not circumcised, you cannot enter the temple of God. You cannot worship at the temple of God. Well, what does that mean? According to Zechariah chapter 14, if you're not allowed to enter Jerusalem and you're not allowed to enter at the temple, you're condemned. You're lost. You're doomed. Okay, so in order to enter Jerusalem and the temple, you have to be circumcised. Oh, but wait. If you're not circumcised, you can't enter there. But again, to repeat, if you can't enter there, you're lost. Okay, so if you're circumcised, in order to enter Jerusalem and the temple, Christ profits you nothing. You are fallen from grace. So, do you choose to be circumcised to obey Ezekiel 44, Zechariah 14, and to be able to worship at this physical temple, offering physical sacrifices that can never take away sin and are not stated ever to be a memorial? So are you circumcised to do that? But if you do that, you lose Christ. Or do you refuse to be circumcised for a religious reason to be justified and thus lose your right to enter the temple, thus being condemned? Folks, when you make Ezekiel 44 a description of a literal physical temple in the millennium, you wind up destroying the gospel of Christ. I don't think anyone wants to do that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are absolutely out of time. William, great to be with you again as always. You got to learn not to talk so much, William. You're just completely taking over this program. I don't know what we're going to do.
I'm working on it.
All right. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.